Right, welcome everyone to our weekly call, for which there's sort of two main topics this week. In a moment, Vinny Parla is going to talk about the recently discovered log4j exploit, and then we're going to just do some reflections on last week's Internet Governance Forum event, and then anything else. I've got a couple of points of any other business, and no doubt others may well do as well. So we'll pick those up as time permits. So without further ado, let me firstly put my screen share on so that people can see Vinny's slides, all being well, which I think this should work. So hopefully everyone can see that first slide.
Yes.
Thank you. In which case, Vinny, without further ado, let me hand over to you, and then you just prompt me when you want me to move the slides on, and I will do that as required.
Sure. So the subject. We got echo here. I don't know if that's you or me. Okay. Hi, I'm Vinny Parla from Cisco. I work in the security CTO office, and I'm just going to quickly cover the log4j exploit, which is, making the rounds all over the place, and everyone's probably pretty familiar with it. But I just wanted to point out some things that may not be obvious about it. And let's go to the next slide. So I'm sure you all know what log4j is, but just in case you don't, it's a popular Java logging engine that's used in many common and popular frameworks in Java, like struts. And it's used widely in enterprise Java applications. And then the other half of the equation is something called JNDI, which is the Java Naming and Directory Interface. And this allows for lookups in alternative resources. And those lookups can return references to Java classes or encoded payloads of the class, which is one of the features of this technology. So beyond just directory services, it actually can return references to other objects. Next slide, please. Oh, go back one. Thank you. So let's put this all together. So this vulnerability was actually introduced in log4j 2.x. And what it was a lookup functionality was added to logging. So essentially you could pass in parameters and a lookup would be done with those parameters. And one of the lookup engines was JNDI. So that was introduced in May of 2016. Coincidentally, in August of 2016, an excellent Black Hat presentation, which I'll encourage you to read, described some serious RCE vectors in the JNDI framework. And you'll see the list there: RMI, LDAP, and Corba. However, there are other possible vectors as well, although these were the ones that were proven to be exploitable. So the big question here is, this all was out there in 2016. So we may be just hearing about it now, but this may have been exploited for a long time, right? Because obviously a smart person would have put these two things together and come up with a recipe. Next slide. So as described, the vulnerability vectors essentially allow the attacker to use one of these forms to reach out to their malicious server. And in the case of RMI and LDAP, there's two ways to deliver the exploit. One is a reference, which means you basically point it to a server that's hosting the Java class, or you can actually serialize the object inside of the response and it'll be deserialized. So you could only have, for example, the LDAP step, in which case there'd just be an LDAP communication to an external server, and that could deliver the payload. or it could be a two-step process, which is the LDAP returns metadata, and then a second connection is made to a server that's hosting that Java class. Next slide. So this is the sort of the attack that everyone has been talking about. And what I want to state up front, what's really important here is not the delivery vehicle. What's important is what is the artifact that is logged. And I'll explain why that's important. So in the simplest example, and the one you see all sorts of POCs on the internet of, is essentially poisoning the user agent with the exploit. And that exploit string that you see on the page is essentially the lookup parameter that gets replaced at runtime by the logging engine. And what that's actually doing is reaching out and making an LDAP query. And that LDAP query could either serialize the object back, or it could return metadata. And in this example, I'm showing returning metadata. And then that logging engine is going to reach out and download the Java class exploit and then run it. So you can see you have a complete RCE engine here that you can, as an attacker, simply just hit any Java server that supports this log4j functionality. And as long as that parameter is logged, this exploit will take place. So someone can mute there, please. Thank you. So you can see here the user agent in this example is what's used. However, that's not a limiting factor at all. What's important is what's logged. So if you logged, something from the body of that request, if you logged an encrypted payload, an encoded payload that maybe is in the parameter, anything that you could potentially log from user input is vulnerable. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate this, there's really infinite input possibilities. So the most popular mechanism is the HTTP headers, user agent being the one that you see in all the POC code. But any input that is potentially logged is a possible delivery system. And that's the really important thing to take from this. So for example, web forms, URL parameters, usernames and email inputs that are commonly logged, JSON REST payload. So imagine a REST API on the back end that had a malicious JSON REST payload, right? All that is needed is the logging component. And payloads can be encoded or encrypted at one stage. So maybe the stage you see them coming into the system, but they're later decoded or decrypted before logging. And it's completely invisible when it's in that encrypted phase and only becomes an exploit when it's decrypted. So, one example you could imagine here is you pass into a web form the malicious payload as your email, and you're prompted back that, hey, that's not a legitimate email format, but that string might have been logged by the logging system to track for auditing purposes. And that action of just logging it is what kicks off this whole exploit vector. Next slide. So the important thing here is, you can put things like WAFs and other inspection mechanisms in front of your servers to try to detect this, but that's not the right approach. Kill the circuit. And what I mean by kill the circuit is prevent that LDAP query or one of the other JNDI queries from actually leaving your data center and going out and reaching that attacker server. That's going to be the most effective way to address this exploit. Obviously, patching your systems when you can, but in the meantime, kill these circuits. Attacking the payload delivery system with a WAF or some other technology, it's just not going to work. Next slide. Oh, sorry, go back one slide. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that LDAP and RMI are the most likely paths for this for this circuit to be completed, but there are other possibilities that could be done, because these are the ones that are enabled by default, but there are additional ones, including like novel networking and DNS, and those haven't really been tried by researchers. And it's possible that in a production environment, one of those other vectors is enabled. So you can't just simply rely on LDAP and RMI, even though they're the most likely paths. There could be other paths. So you really need to look for those. And, you know, having the ability to just set policies in your data centers to say, don't let my servers make outbound connections to resources outside of, you know, patch management servers that you are well known and you know about. So if you can build those kind of constraints in your data center to limit what your servers can reach out to, it's going to help break this circuit. And that's the really important piece, is breaking the circuit. The input is infinite. There is no way to know where these payloads are. Certainly the script kiddie things that you're seeing on the internet right now are all in user agent and places like HTTP headers, but they could be anywhere. Next. And I have a LinkedIn that goes into a lot more detail on this that you guys can go look at, and open for questions. Thank you. Hope this was helpful.
Brilliant, thanks, Vinny. Helpful, if not slightly scary, particularly when I think I heard you say this has maybe been out there for as long as, what, 4 years possibly. Sorry, 5 years even.
Correct. And I know that Cloudflare has publicly stated they've seen this earlier than when it was publicly known. And I know of a researcher who said that he believes he's seen this in May of this year and maybe earlier. So certainly it's been going on for a little while and possibly for years. Peter, I see you have your hand up.
Sorry, 1 second. There we go. Thanks, Vinny. That was a really good presentation. Quite really useful, and I love the fact you pointed out the infinite possibilities. Yeah, it's really serious. I was just curious to hear whether you had any thoughts on, first of all, if you could think of any ways for using DNS to prevent this in any way, but also if you can use any ways of using DNS to detect it from like historical records.
I don't know that DNS would be helpful here, because you could do an LDAP connection, and that payload you could craft could also pick the port, right? Because it's a standard URI type mechanism. And it could be an IP address instead of a domain, so no lookup would even occur. So I'm not 100%.
No, I didn't have any.
I'm not 100% sure if DNS is all that useful here. You might certainly pick up some, right, from well-known like attack servers and things like that. But
yeah,
you know, it's the stuff that you don't know about that is more frightening.
Yeah.
You know, and even if this is, and I didn't get a chance to put this in the slides, but it's in my LinkedIn presentation. Even if you remediate your systems, you don't know where the attacker has moved laterally and set up persistence. So for example, they could have come in and exploited your Java node. And then because Tomcat or something else was running as root and had, you know, your app had log4j running, and there's a lot of legacy apps that are set up that way. They could have exploited that, maybe got some credentials to move laterally to a Windows system and set up their persistence on the Windows system that has no Java at all on it. And so your scanners are going to go out and go, oh, well, hey, that's a Windows system with no Java. Life's great, right? But meanwhile, that's their actual foothold. So the problem is it's not enough at this point to patch these vulnerabilities. If you believe you've been exploited, you need to monitor all of your systems in your data center, because they could be, they could already be compromised. And depending on the level of access you have on the system, you may need to re-image your systems down to the BIOS level, because they could put, you know, UEFI persistence in there if they have the right permissions. So you know, you may actually literally be throwing machines out because you don't trust them anymore. That's how bad
Yeah.
this is. This exploit will be far worse than SolarWinds or Heartbleed or any prior exploit that's happened before. It's going to be massive in the industry. So it's pretty concerning.
Yeah, I personally, I completely agree. I was curious whether you had anything that I couldn't think of, basically.
No, I don't, and
yeah.
it's unfortunate because I love DNS security. I think it's a really great tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
The only thing I will say is, you could potentially be protected if your data center DNS is something you control, which hopefully it is, and you can at least monitor for external servers that you don't know about, right? So seeing DNS requests to a Linux distro update server is something you might expect, even though that I think is a bad practice. These updaters are a bad practice in the data center. They're fine for laptops, but worst case, if you're allowing these auto updaters of your system images from your data centers, at least that list is pretty well known. So you could use DNS there to say, if it's not in this list of 15 well-known external servers that I trust, block it. Like, I think that would be a decent use of DNS security, but you still have to have IP layer blocking because these payloads can be IP addresses.
Yeah. I mean, I think that applies to kind of other kinds of exploits as well. But for Log4j, I couldn't think of anything specifically with DNS that we could do to protect people. So, all right, well, thank you, and thanks again for the presentation.
The other thing is DNS could be an attack vector because that is a plugin for JNDI, and although it's disabled by default, and I don't know what its capabilities are because I honestly haven't researched it, but that's another sort of concern, is that LDAP and RMI are going to be obvious, but there are many other plugins, and those could be enabled in some legacy Java product that's sitting in some credit card processing company they don't touch because it just works, right? But it's it's vulnerable. Who knows? It's going to take a long time to find all of these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I can see Kurt has put a question in the chat. Vinny, I don't know if you can see that. I'll just scroll back up. Is there a way to check if one runs a vulnerable J4NI stack?
Yeah, so in my LinkedIn post, it talks about a setting that will prevent the LDAP download of remote code from a URL. I don't know if it will block the deserialization vector, but these are disabled by default in certain versions of the JDK, and that's published on Oracle's site in terms of that, so go look there. But again, it doesn't mean that in a production environment they weren't re-enabled, right? For some functionality, something like LDAP, is a perfect example. There's lots of Java applications that do LDAP lookups, right? So the question is constraining those to your internal LDAP servers as opposed to an LDAP server on the internet, right? I see another question here on LDAP protocol filtering. Yes, it certainly would be very helpful to do that, but there also is RMI. So now you got to do both LDAP and RMI, and then what other custom protocols are enabled in a legacy app? Like, we all laugh at, okay, Novell, nobody's using that anymore, but that protocol over TCP exists. So if someone has turned that plugin on and that plugin is able to do the same thing that LDAP or RMI can do. And again, I haven't researched that part. That's going to be something I do as a follow-on. But it is possible that one of these and you can write your own plugin. So there could be some proprietary protocol that, Vinny's directory service protocol that does the exact same thing as LDAP that I've enabled in a production server that does something very similar, right? Fetches parameters and could enable this. So it really, I think the best strategy is just block your workloads from reaching external network resources that you're not familiar with. That would be the recipe I would go with, and that is going to break the circuit because you're going to limit what your workloads can connect to. And in the case of servers, it should be a constrainable, manageable list because, you know, most people do server patch management internally. They don't let them do auto update. So what those things are like connecting to should be controllable. Now, you know, that doesn't deal with endpoints, and, you know, that's another issue, but it certainly would handle the server vector. But your laptop, if you have some kind of Java component running there that has the same exploit, it could possibly be triggered as well. Thank you.
Thanks for the question there. Anyone else got any questions for Vinny? Give you a chance to raise your hand. We'll pop anything in the chat. I'm not seeing anything at the moment. I think a bit depressing, but important for people to be clear on the scale of the threat, Vinny.
Yeah, and please make your approach breaking that circuit. Don't try to deal with it. You know, you can put WAFs out there to help with some of this stuff, but that don't trust the front end is where to deal with this. It's that back end circuit breaking is where to protect yourself here. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Vinny. Appreciate coming on and doing that at short notice. So a note of caution for anyone, and always good to hear mentions of Novell NetWare, which sort of reminiscent of my youth, which is a long, long time ago, working with the guys in Utah back in the day. But anyway, all right, let's change the subject somewhat. As I said last week, we would do a little bit of a sort of brief sort of highlights from IGF, Internet Governance Forum last week. So I'm going to sort of just switch to do that now. If you just bear with me whilst I swap screens, make sure I get to the right one. So yeah, let's just do some observations from last week in Poland. I thought I'd start just by sort of giving the sort of an entirely partial take on what I saw as some of the common themes that came up in multiple sessions that certainly I was in. Which, bear in mind, I selected the session, so I'm not pretending this is entirely representative across the totality of the whole of the event. But just give you a feel for what came up, and in the order I put them on the screen, certainly digital sovereignty did come up in a fair few of the workshops and other sessions, and associated with that, if you like, the downside of it, i.e. the splinternet, etc. So that collectively came up multiple times, as did encryption, probably unsurprisingly, and the importance of end-to-end encryption, but also linked to that sort of privacy as a human right versus the trade-offs with other human rights, such as sort of safety, for example. So certainly just sort of both sides of that particular coin. Unsurprisingly, governance came up a lot. Shock for the Internet Governance Forum, but in particular linked to the multi-stakeholder model. And certainly in some of the discussions I was in, and partly because I brought it up myself, the importance of getting the multi-stakeholder model applying better to the development of internet standards and getting more activity from some of the non-tech stakeholders into the internet standards bodies, and why that mattered. Antitrust came up quite a lot in a whole lot of different contexts around sort of centralization, the sort of domination by all of the obvious big players, etc., etc. And overall, and again, unsurprisingly, almost all of the discussions were really all about policy, and very, very little of the discussion more than scraped the surface when it got to really giving any thought to the sort of technology in any at all specific way. So very much in the upper layers. In complete contrast, for example, to the IETF, but you would expect that given what the event is billed at. Just to give a view which is not mine, and then I can see somebody's raised their hand, so I'll come on to that in a second. Here's some feedback from a fellow attendee, so not me, who, as you can see, her comment was about the depth and quality of discussions around complex issues on the interplay between content regulation, data protection, and competition, which, amongst other sessions, we explored in the DNS privacy session, which I'm coming on to a moment, and then other cross-cutting topics like transparency, interpretations of autonomy and sovereignty from both a technical and political perspective. And then it was also great to see a range of stakeholders moving between beyond agreement or principles and toward proposals for operationalization, for example, through suggested content moderation governance flows or actionable recommendations around risk/impact assessments. So moving just beyond just talk onto what to do about it, which is important, because I know some of the prior feedback about IGF has been a lot of talk and insufficient sort of follow-up and doing post event. So maybe this time there's going to be greater focus on the follow-up, which will be good. Glenn, I see you've raised your hand. Did you want to jump in on any of what we've covered so far?
Well, I want to follow up on the comments you made that there was discussion around more getting involved from non-traditional technical participants in the technical discussions. And I was just curious to get your impression on sort of what the core there was, who was making those statements, what direction were they suggesting it? Or was it just the, hey, you really should, if you want to know what's going on, you should go over to where these guys are talking about it?
So, I mean, yes, it was certainly some of that, but I suppose more specifically, I think an acceptance that governments, regulators, in particular antitrust regulators, maybe need to get more directly involved in the standards bodies. And certainly in a couple of the workshops that I was in, there seemed to be agreement that would be a good thing, but admittedly without any specific sort of follow-up action sort of noted in order to make that a reality. But I think at least acceptance of the principle that sort of governments and other interested parties really ought to pay better attention to the standards bodies, and acceptance that they're not really doing that at the moment.
And was that coming from like various government participants, or was that coming from civil society participants? Who was making those assertions? I'm sort of trying to drill down a little bit, because it always strikes me as interesting that we have this dual sort of behavior amongst some mindsets, which is keep the government out, and then the other one is get the government more involved. And sometimes I've heard that said in the same sentence.
Fantastic. So from memory, and I'd have to go back through my notes, I think the sort of sentiment, or at least agreement with the sentiment, was coming more from people involved in the sort of the government stakeholder grouping. So there seemed to be an acknowledgement from, if you like, that side that they ought to be paying closer attention. Whether, as I say, whether that translates to any specific action remains to be seen, but I think it's kind of interesting that there's at least an agreement that they ought to, which is a good start. And as an aside, I know in recent discussions with the European Commission, again, they've, I think, acknowledged that they probably should be doing more in that space. Again, whether they have the intent and capacity to do so, let's see. But who knows? Maybe for this coming calendar year, we might see a slightly sort of broadening of the stakeholder engagement within bodies like the IETF, which, in my personal opinion, will be a really good thing. Okay, let me just very briefly, since we only had the one session which focused at all on sort of DNS technology, which ICANN was the sort of sponsor of, if you will, and Paul Hoffman was the sort of facilitator stroke chair for the discussion. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but just I'm going to just scroll through these to highlight some of the content which I covered in my slot, which the order that we did this, we had sort of three panelists. I started by talking about some of the sort of technology, and then my co-panelists, Carlos, gave more of an ISP perspective, and Roxana then talked perhaps more about the likelihood of a greater move to the cloud resolvers. So we went from sort of client end, sort of gradually broadening out. There was a sort of logic to it. But the reason I thought I would just touch on this briefly was to highlight we were trying to pull out the policy rather than so much the technical issues. And of course, part of the challenge with the IGF is you have no idea what level of technical knowledge the audience brings into these sorts of discussions. And I think we had sort of net between the sort of online and in-person participants, 60 to 70 people in this particular conversation. So very briefly, so I just sort of touched on what the difference between sort of traditional and encrypted DNS was. Happened to use DOE as the example, just to make the point that even if it's encrypted, the resolver operator in this scenario still sees all of the queries. So it just cuts out any potential intermediaries from the equation. Then we discussed briefly the how you get the client software to migrate from so existing resolver to an encrypted resolver, and we sort of went through a couple of the issues in that, such as maybe if it's initiated by the client, possibly overriding local choices and creating policy challenges. And also for those of us involved in ADD, just highlighting some of the work in progress, and probably long term where maybe DNR is the right answer for much of the current resolver traffic, but that has a longer sort of cycle time because of the potential need for upgraded CPE. And then there's other stuff coming, DNS over quick, oblivious, even though over Tor, but from a sort of policy point of view, well not even policy, but just some of the issues there, DNS over quick maybe has performance benefits, but still, as with DOE, the resolver operator sees the queries. Oblivious currently suffers from the flaw of it can't detect colluding proxies, so may not offer any real privacy gains. And even with DOE over Tor, digital fingerprinting is still possible unless you're extremely careful in your settings. We then touched on private relay, and again, some of the issues there around centralization, compliance, and antitrust. Before mentioning there's other stuff coming like ECH, but also the European Commission as a sort of counter to some of the technical sort of changes and concerns around resilience and centralization, is this coming calendar year likely to be sort of actioning its planned project, sort of DNS for EU, to bring a new open resolver onto the scene that's operated within Europe, and therefore would be definitely having to operate within the limitations and constraints of GDPR, e-privacy, etc. But dare I say it, to this particular audience, technology, whilst it's good and clever, can't solve everything. And yeah, there are limitations, and you need to also think about regulation, legislation, and that needs to keep pace, but also other stuff like the privacy and transparency policies of suppliers, which led us into sort of talking about privacy and transparency policies, and why consideration of the European Resolver policy is important to ensure proper compliance with GDPR, etc., as well as a clear prohibition of monetization of personal data, and clarity on what jurisdiction services are being operated under. And then I thought that was pretty much it, and then we moved on to the next session. So that was a quick run through, but I thought you might maybe find that interesting in terms of the sort of somewhat different emphasis, not so much on the technology. Mine was the most technology specific of the three sort of panelists. But trying to tease out what some of the policy issues are, all the stuff that we're not allowed to talk about in the IETF because it's policy, whereas obviously the sort of intent within the IGF is absolutely to look at those issues, arguably rather more so than worrying so much about the technology. I can see while I've been talking, I think Michael sort of commented about some of the sort of digital sovereignty discussions, and yeah, Milton Muller from the Internet Governance Project did indeed differentiate between digital sovereignty and digital self-determination, and rightly commented that digital sovereignty is about the sort of the nation state, as opposed to digital self-determination, which is about the individual. Which I think was an entirely fair comment. And Tony, yeah, about some of the discussion around the evils of centralization, to somewhat simplify what you've actually said to Tony, but I think that was the gist of it. So I'll stop there for a moment. That was a deliberately very quick run through. I'll happily share the slides afterwards should anyone be interested in looking at those specifically, but that was just to give you a sense of the only DNS specific session that we had. I'll put a link to the recording as well with a link to the recording of this call, and then you can dial into the I think we had a 90-minute session overall. So clearly I've distilled that down into about 10 minutes. So definitely haven't done it complete justice, but it led to an interesting sort of Q&A element with, I know Mallory Nodal, who was in Poland, came to the mic a couple of times, as did Colin Cure from Ofcom. And there were some other comments, particularly in the chat actually, which was quite lively for the mainly for the virtual participants. So quite an interesting discussion ensued.
Yeah, I was going to say it's Tony, like what Tommy wrote, the gist of that post is not kind of strongly countervailing to the notion that regulatory people should get more involved in the standards bodies or that technical standards development, has been the cause of whatever the situation is now, or could be the solution to heading off some, future unwanted state. Jeff's point is actually that that's the wrong place to look.
Yeah, although I think that point is, well, because that's within the architecture discuss sort of mailing list IETF. I'm not sure that's a settled view.
No, far from it. But I found Jeff's points more convincing than any of the others.
Yeah.
So I mean, if regulatory people are feeling sure that they need to get more involved in standards bodies, I would say that is far from settled and really should be looked at with a jaundiced eye.
Well, it'd be interesting if they don't. Of course, they have to bring with them a degree of knowledge of technical issues. They can't just land. Otherwise, it won't be a particularly fruitful engagement without some appropriate background. Although, in fairness, some of them do have plenty of technical expertise, but not all. It certainly led, I think, to some interesting discussions, and certainly, anyone that's not following the architecture discussed mailing list by chance that happens to have come up. I've forgotten who posted the original proposal for the IAB to get more involved and maybe host a centralization workshop a few days ago.
Yari may have done the original posting. I can't remember that far back, but I think it might have been Yari.
Yeah, yes, he did. But there was a thread started, I think maybe over the weekend or just before, with a draft, which has just been published, and I can't remember who the author was, but I'm sure that the link that Tony has hopefully sort of put in the chat will take anyone there to have a proper look. It's certainly worth a read, and some good points been made in that particular thread over the last few days, both for and against. I don't know if anybody else that sort of joined any of the sessions last week had any other comments that you wished to make. Not necessarily consistent with the ones I've just said, but feel free to jump on if you do. I'm not seeing any hands raised or any new points on the chat. Actually, so as I said, Tony is, don't look to technical solutions or involvement to address economic / regulatory / political concerns. Yeah, which is fair. Yeah. Okay, let's move on then. So I will go back to my slide mainly because it summarizes all the points. So that brings us neatly on to any other business. So a couple of things for me. Firstly, a reminder that tomorrow, in fact, the ICANN Resolver Operator Forum takes place, 1500 UTC through to 1800 UTC. The agenda has been expanded somewhat since it was originally set up, so it runs to 3 hours now rather than 2, with a large number of sort of speakers from a good range of organizations. So I'm sure that will be well worth attending if your diaries permit. Just looking ahead slightly, this time next week is our pre-Christmas carol concert, which is unlikely to feature singing as such, although it should feature the world first viewing of DNS being used to play Christmas carols, as Peter unveils his response to our inaugural Ask Peter slot from last week of new things that we would like to see the DNS do. So I'm sure that will be absolutely amazing to see that. So if Peter's still on, we're all looking forward to that bated breath. Looks like he's somewhat wisely left. I will have to remind him afterwards of that. I'm still in touch with Chris Wood at Cloudflare to see if we can get Chris or one of his colleagues to join us on the call, not necessarily next Monday, but in due course, to talk about Cloudflare's sort of take on ECH and separately Google's on DO. And I think it also in the new year, it's been suggested that we do a sort of revisit some of the various people that are running DO resolvers and how those are scaling up, both operationally, but also what level of traffic they're seeing, etc. So I'll probably reach out to some of you separately to see if you'd like to be involved in that. Something we did, I think, roughly 6 months ago. I think that will be timely to take a look at that. But after next Monday, I propose we won't do any further calls through to the 10th of January. So we will miss the following 2 weeks, because I'm sure you'll all be doing far more interesting things, hopefully with friends and families. So that's everything from me. Does anyone else have anything else that you would like to raise this week? Just give you a moment to either put anything in the chat or just.
Hey, Andrew, Glenn here. So those who have been following the ADD list probably noted that we finally published late last week some stuff about the split DNS and moving forward there. So we haven't scheduled a session yet, but we're going to be talking with the area directors and the other groups to see what makes sense. Clearly, split DNS is something that many people have identified as a very important use case to address. Clearly, we know it's in use quite widely. Whether or not people like it or not, it's also one of those things where you know it's out there. And so stay tuned, watch for that. You know, we'll get the information out to people when we can. Clearly, the holidays are going to sort of mess up getting people responding to email and moving forward quickly, but we're on it and we'll get there. So don't lose focus on that topic, because it's an important one.
On that, Glenn, I think there was a suggestion on the mailing list about maybe doing something joint with, was it DNS Ops, I think?
Yeah, it's a perfectly fine suggestion. So we'll see if the DNS Ops chairs are interested in doing that, and do sort of a, you know, see where that evolves. Maybe it just becomes like a focused target session. We're talking about the issues around it. I'll point out a lot of the issues that have been raised are good issues. They've also been issues we've been living with for a very long time, and I'm not going to be overly optimistic that we're going to solve all of them in quick order, or some of them ever.
Yeah, and as you say, imperfect though it may be, it exists, which is a tad inconvenient, but there you are. That's true of many things in life, sadly.
I mean, just for the fun of it, I'm just waiting for somebody to propose that we, now's the big moment to get rid of DNS, and we'll move to the next directory system that somebody's going to propose. You know, we have IPv10, so maybe we need the new DNS. So here's everyone's opportunity.
Yeah, I'll look forward to you mentioning that to the enthusiastic proponent of IPv10.
So we'll see where it goes.
Fair enough. Yeah, and also I think there are a couple of other decisions also on the mailing list from our illustrious co-chairs around adoption or not of at least one other document, if I recall. Blown if I can remember.
I think our branding is friendly co-chairs.
Friendly.
Yes, we're your friendly co-chairs.
Yeah. I think there was one that you decided in overall I think the consensus was not to adopt. I can't remember which document it was off the top of my head.
It was the deployment considerations document. And the issue there was it covers a lot of territory. It has a lot of material in there. It goes into some areas that are not within the ADD charter, but it has some stuff in there which does apply to ADD. So within the ADD charter, there is in fact an informational document around discovery that is part of the charter's work items to produce. And so that is a document which we need to work on. We need some authors to step up. There's material in the document which didn't make the consensus to get adopted that likely belongs in that document, not all of it, but portions of it. And then a new original material about the deployment not deployment considerations, but informational stuff around the ADD material. So it will probably cover things like DNR and DDR and all these other aspects around it. Go read the charter, you can see the sort of informational scope that was put on that document when we chartered ADD and created that slot for that informational document. So that's a thing that definitely will need to be worked on in the coming year when we hit 22.
Yeah, which makes good sense. Excellent. Well, thank you for that clarification from our friendly co-chairs who get the big bucks, but because of that, they get to make the big decisions as well, which is important. Keep us all on the right side of the line. Okay, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, so I think we'll call it a day there. So thanks everyone for your time, and have a fantastic week, and we'll see everyone again for one last time this calendar year, same time next Monday. So see you all again then. Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Toodles.